Hello YouTube, how's everybody doing? Helen the Russian here. So as promised, today I'm gonna do a video on the guy who built Caesars Palace. His name was Jay Sarno. It's an interesting bit of Las Vegas history. I'm a bit of a Las Vegas history buff. I know a lot of interesting stories, and I tell them when the chance presents itself to my passengers, and actually people really appreciate it. I've been getting really good tips, and then I've been getting comments like great storyteller, nice conversation, whatnot. So anyhow, Jay Sarno, he was not a Las Vegas man originally. Jay was from Atlanta, and he was self-proclaimed hotel man. The whole story and biography is very long, so I just gonna try and condense it in a few minutes. So Jay started building. He was from poor migrants family, and he was definitely self-made man. That's for sure. He started very early in life. In what we now call entrepreneurial spirit. So he did a few different things. He was very impressed when he went to Florida with the famous hotel of the day, Fontainebleau, and he decided he's going to build something spectacular just like that or even better. Jay was the one, and he did. He had built the hotel. They were called. He started building a chain of the hotels. The first one he built in Florida, he called it Cabana, and then he built one in Atlanta, and then he built one in California. So he was not new to the game. It's just Jay always did things kind of on a whim, and he didn't necessarily plan a lot of things financially ahead. He was constantly looking to finance things, and he was degenerate gambler, self-admitted, and it was well-known fact. That was not a secret. So he was gambling well before he got to Vegas, and of course back then gambling was illegal everywhere else. When I say degenerate, I mean he gambled for the sake of gambling. He didn't gamble to win. I mean, he just liked that rush. He gambled on playing golf. He gambled playing gin rummy. He gambled on everything he could put a bet on, really. So he was one, as far as the architecture goes, he was the first to create what's called block facade. It's not done anymore, but basically that intricate. Those of you who lived in Vegas for a very long time and remember what old Caesars Palace looked like, because now there is not a trace of what Jay originally built. There is none of that building his original build. But back then, and that's what his cabanas had, it's those big concrete blocks with designer cutouts it's a wall that you put in front of the actual hotel, meaning it lets in just enough light so the rooms are not dark. But what it enabled the builder or the owner to do is you build a really cheap building, like nondescript cheap building, and then you put that block facade in front of it, and it made it look really intricate, especially with Caesars. He lit it up with the neon from beneath, and it looked really sexy, when in reality it wasn't anything fabulous, but it looked fabulous, and that's what Jay was all about. So he first came to Las Vegas on a junket. You'll know what junket is, when they bring the gamblers in with hopes that they gamble and spend money, back in '63. And he was not impressed with the looks of these hotels. He had these big expectations, and he walked around, and he actually took time and not only spent the time in Flamingo where his junket was, but he walked in and out all over the strip, which wasn't big back then, and he just wasn't impressed. And he got that idea. He wants to build something absolutely mind-blowingly amazing. And he did. Ultimately, he succeeded. That's what Caesars Palace was, which originally he was going to call it Desert Cabana, because, like I said, he was building those cabanas, and they were quite successful. But slowly but surely, he came to name it Caesars Palace. And originally, it was Caesars without apostrophe, because he said every man who walks, and I mean men, yeah, he kind of didn't consider women big gamblers, so he said every man who walks in there should feel like a Caesar. So it was Caesars Palace without the apostrophe. To get the money for this venture, back then he spent 19 million. So think, back in '64, 19 million was absolutely ridiculous amount of money. Jay was friends with Jimmy Hoffa. It's a well-known fact. Now, see, here is where people get confused. People like to bring mafia into everything, and everybody is a mobster. Jay had nothing to do with the mob whatsoever. He really didn't. He was introduced to Jimmy Hoffa back when he was looking to finance his original cabana. Hoffa lent him the money out of the Teamsters pension fund, and because he was getting good returns, and at the time it was good political situation because obviously Hoffa used Cabana's conference rooms for union conferences. Clearly he was number one person and always welcome. It all worked out, but Jay had ties. He was telling everybody he's Hoffa's friend. He wasn't making a secret out of it. That's why a lot of people are confused about the whole mob thing. Jay had nothing to do with mob. He just took money, borrowed money from Hoffa. So Teamsters, through Hoffa, gave Jay 10 million, but he needed to raise another 9, and so he was looking for investors. Everybody thought back then, see, the hindsight is always 2020. People were not lending him money. Back then, proper financial institutions were not loaning money to casinos at all, so he had to go to private investors, and people thought he was just absolutely crazy. They thought it will never work out, it's gonna be a bum project. So he was having a hard time raising the remainder 9 million that he needed. And again, it's a long story, but he found someone who knew somebody. And ultimately, yeah, there were some shady characters that had interest in Caesars Palace, which I'll tell you in a minute why Jay had to sell it pretty quick. But again, Jay had nothing to do with the mob. He wanted money to finance the casino, and it was not directly mob money that he took, but the investors were connected to other people, and they were connected to other people, and ultimately that's how he ended up with the casino manager in original Caesars, who was connected through various different sources to the mobsters. Anyhow, Jay conceived that plan, and he was a great big visionary, and he constantly changed his mind. So the whole big fountain thing, there is not much left of those fountains now, but those are the famous fountains over which Evel Knievel jumped on his motorcycle and almost killed himself in 67. So that's another thing that Caesars Palace is famous for. Caesars Palace opened in 66, and grand opening had to be postponed a little, and literally till the very last minute they were putting it together. It was not going smoothly. There was an airline strike at the time right around the grand opening, and because Jay needed wealthy people from East Coast to come in, that was presenting a problem. There was literally tens of thousands of dollars worth of furniture sitting in the parking lot with the workers trying to put it in the rooms as the guests were checking in. Oftentimes the guest would check in and there would be couch or brought in or shower curtain hanging in the room as they already checked in. But that grand opening went on for several days. There was nearly over $1 million spent. Again, think it's back in 66, $1 million, a lot of money to spend. And it was all about, Jay was all about lavish indulgence, which is why he is not that well celebrated in Las Vegas, because nowadays, you know, there is Gamblers Anonymous, we're all talking about doing it for fun and moderation. Jay was not about moderation, let me know. No. He liked his food, he ate, people were always amazed at how much he could put away. He was not skinny, he was overweight, and he gambled, like I said, degenerate gambler. He was a huge womanizer. He was married for a long time and had kids, but that never stopped him. So he was well known among female populace of Las Vegas and other cities for being a womanizer. He was a generous womanizer, and a lot of women quite liked to be acquainted with him because he was known to buy them fur coats, cars, in some cases houses and apartments. He had a long-standing mistress along with his wife, but the smaller conquests that happen every day, sometimes several times a day. So Jay was dead, so that's probably why not much celebrate. But for a while, he was Mr. Las Vegas. He definitely was. He was known on the strip as Mr. S. He had casino credit in every casino. He maintained a lavish suite at Caesars Palace, where he spent a lot of time. And Caesars Palace, in its day, and even to this day, is one of the most famous and well celebrated casinos in the world. It still is to the day, but it was definitely back then. There was nothing like that anywhere in the world. He had this vision, the restaurants, the rooms, the gaming floor, the hotel. He was charging, when he opened Caesars, he was charging $14 a night for rooms, when everybody else the maximum price was $9, and most of them charge 5 to 7. So you can get the idea of how it all was working out. Jay Sarno also was the one who built Circus, which not many people know. He built it. He opened it in '68, and it was at the time only casino. There was no hotel attached to it because he could not get enough financing to do the hotel. So it was casino only, and he conceived it as a circus. So the entrance to it was actually from the second floor, and people had options. They could walk down grand staircase, they could roll down the chute. There was some other, there were circus acts happening as the gaming was taking place. So just over the casino floor, they had acrobats, they had trapeze artists, they had all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And the entrance, you had to pay to enter, which again, back then that was unheard of. I think you had to pay $2, which caused a bit of a grumble among locals. But you got all that money back. There were arcade games, so kids were welcome, because on the second floor there were all kinds of arcade games that had nothing to do with casino gambling, and you could do that, and you was getting crazy prices. And again, there is mob connection, which is not really a connection because of people involved in the financing. There was a gift shop concession given to Tony Spilotro, and many of you know who Tony Spilotro is. He was for a while a famous strip enforcer, and he was a horrible. He is featured in movie Casino. What's his name? The Danny DeVito, I think, played him. The little, because Tony Spilotro was quite little guy, but gosh, he killed a lot of people, and he himself was assassinated by the mob, and his body was never found, and that was back in the 80s. So there was that connection, but Jay did not know who Tony was or what was happening. You know, that concession, no one wanted the gift shop concession in Circus, and Tony was the one to apply for it, but obviously that was backed by the mob, and that's because they all had to have a legit presence. They couldn't just be running around the strip and casinos with guns and saying, I'm mob. They had to have some kind of sort of legit presence. So that was that. Caesars Palace, once Jay opened it, it was obviously fantastic and spectacular. They were, apart from the furniture being loaded till the very last minute, there were some minor issues. Back then, when casino first opened the doors, Gaming Commission required you to have 350,000 behind the cashier's booth, just so you don't run out of money. In case all the gamblers are lucky and they all winning, casino cannot run out of money, because then it gets immediately shut down. That's the law. And Jay only had 100,000 behind the cashier's cage, and he was sweating that. And for a while, it looked like they might run out of money and get shut down on the very first day of grand opening. But back then, there were ways to fix it, and which is when people like the casino manager he's got were helpful, because they'll make phone calls, and they usually say on the phone, because a lot of phones were tapped, so they would say, "Craps table is on fire at Caesars Palace. Send the firefighter," and someone would come, and it was a bit rigged and kind of rigged the game so the fortunes would turn. So they made it. They basically made it as far as that deal was concerned. But that's how things were done back in the day, and it's a bit of an interesting story as well in and on itself. I might do a video separately on the whole culture of how things were happening back then. So back to Jay. He sold Caesars Palace very shortly after he opened it, mainly because it was riddled with these problems. The mob wanted piece of action. Money was skimmed, although no one could prove it. But there is, without proof, everybody kind of knew that what was happening, and Jay didn't want anything to do with that. So he was trying to get rid of it. So ultimately, he sold it to Perlman Brothers, who own the chain of restaurants named Lumps from Florida. So they are the ones who, well, they initially leased it and they ultimately bought it from him. So he was no longer the owner, but he maintained a high roller suite at Caesars up until he died. And he maintained the suite at Circus Circus as well. The number in Circus Circus, the number of the suite was 1410. I can't remember the number of the suite at Caesars Palace. I think it was 1066 or 1016. I can't remember now. But it was a very lavish suite, and it was reserved for him. And especially when Caesars was just leased, Jay was living in there all the time, and he had a habit of schlepping into Perlman's office in the bathrobe and the slippers and then have a chat, and they really did not like that, but there was nothing they could do up until they bought it outright from him. Now, originally, the land from Caesars Palace, Jay leased, guess from whom? Kirk Kerkorian, yes, the famous Kirk Kerkorian, who later built the MGM original MGM, and then the International that later became Las Vegas Hilton, that is now known as Westgate. So the land was originally leased. Kirk Kerkorian was Jay's landlord, and Jay, like I said, he was always stretched for that money, and so the way he paid the first months, and there was a time he didn't think he was even going to make the second month's lease payment on Caesars Palace before he even built the hotel casino, but it all ultimately worked out. There is another interesting piece of information. Ultimately, Howard Hughes became the landowner of that. But there was a bit of a caveat. There was a short, narrow strip of land, 1.1 acres, just up front, fronting Las Vegas Strip about 100 yards and then going back. And that piece of land Steve Wynn eventually bought and leveraged it. Perlman Brothers had to buy it from him for almost twice the price, nearly immediately, and that's how Steve got the money to buy Golden Nugget downtown. But that's a whole different story. But like I said, in Las Vegas, everything intertwined. You don't realize how many connections there are. And Steve Wynn was actually protege of Jay Sarno. Now, back to Jay Sarno. He truly was a visionary. He did change Las Vegas, definitely. The way it was, Las Vegas was never the same after Jay. He started this era of lavish hotels that really was not the case before. It was just the casinos and very basic hotels and not very flashy ones at that. But Jay also conceived the idea of building the first mega resort. He didn't get to do it. I'll tell you in a minute why. But if he did, he would be 10 years, so the whole decade ahead of the first ever mega resort, which was Mirage, my favorite resort. Steve Wynn built that. But Jay actually was going to build mega resort. He was a visionary, so he envisioned the whole thing. And he was going to call it Grandissimo, and guess where he was going to build it? He already had the land leased. He had it leased for a while, and then he ran out of money, had to give it up. Right around where the Raiders Stadium is going to be built now, right around that area. It was going to happen. Grandissimo was going to be built, but he couldn't get financing. Jay was trying to get the financing. He tried and he just couldn't. So Grandissimo didn't happen, but the idea, and he shared the idea with Steve Wynn, which Steve Wynn 10 years later, right around there, he made it happen with the Mirage. Again, everything is interconnected. And Steve Wynn was at the grand opening of the Caesars. Back then, Steve Wynn was not Steve Wynn that we know now. He was just some guy who owned some bingo halls back east. No one knew who he was, and the only reason he even got introduced to Jay initially, because he was married to Elaine Pascal back then, and Jay knew Pascal's, and that's he would not know who Steve was or who his father was. It would have been nobody, but it didn't end up being that way. Steve went and introduced himself. He said he's married to Elaine Pascal, and Jay moved him to a nicer room. It was Steve, by the way, who said, oh, they were putting shower curtain in my room after I already checked in, and so Jay moved him to a high roller suite, showed him some respect, and that's how that friendship and mentorship started. Now, the very interesting bit of information, and the very last one, Jay, like I said, he was a Mr. Las Vegas for a very long time, gambled heavily. He gambled playing golf at the country club, and people were, back then there was a bit of a racket going on, and Jay probably was well aware it was a racket, but he couldn't help himself. He just wanted to gamble, and those kinds of stakes that those people were offering who were running the racket, no one else would offer him. So they cheated, and he lost a lot of money, but he still did it because that's what he lived for. That and women and food. That was definitely Jay. So how Jay died? Very interesting story. His grown children, by then they were grown. His daughter September had this friend, Mimi Morton, her name was, and Mimi was young, very striking, beautiful, well, not a girl, young woman, I should say, and she was somewhat infamous. She had affairs with famous politicians and dignitaries, and she was bugging September to introduce her to Jay, and the reason she did, because she knew that Jay was very generous with his conquests. So, she wasn't really making big secret out of it. So anyhow, September caved in, and Mimi came to Las Vegas, and Jay was very eager to meet her. He picked her up in a limo from the Sands. I think she was staying at the Sands initially. And of course, he took her to Caesars Palace. He no longer owned it, but he maintained the suite. He was still a big man in there. So he gambled, and then they went and ate dinner. And then he wanted to take her to his famous, he told her about that suite, and she was just cooing, going, oh, I just want to see that, let's just go see it. And so they did. In fact, they stopped by the gift shop on the way because he wanted to buy that herbal essences bath, because they wanted to sit in the jacuzzi and enjoy it. And so they did, and they did have a tryst. And she noticed that Jay is not looking all that well. Once again, Jay was not a well man as far as his health goes. He had diabetes, he was grossly overweight, he was not looking after himself. And she noticed that he's not looking well, he's getting kind of grayish. And he said, hey honey, are you looking okay? Are you okay? And he said, no, I'm fine. In fact, Jay was probably contemplating the second round, and he collapsed. So that's exactly how it happened, because that story grew legs. You'd hear that, oh, he was in the suite with 5 girls and they were going at it like crazy, and he died right in the middle of the act. Well, no, not really. They went up, they had fun, we're all adults, so you know what I mean when I say they had their fun. And he was just sitting in the chair and, probably contemplating round 2, when he collapsed. He had a heart attack. He didn't die straight away. She called the security, they called ambulance. He died in the ambulance, or I can't remember, in the ambulance to the way to the hospital, or just as he arrived to the hospital. But he was not in the hospital long. He was dead. I think he died on the way there. So that's how he died. Very fitting for the lifestyle he lived. Once again, not many people mention him anymore, but I already told you why. But his daughter, she did lobby heavily for a street to be named after him. And so those of you who are drivers, they know which one. That's the back from Frank Sinatra. There is a street that leads into Caesars Palace. It's called Jay Sarno Way. That was named after him. And it goes all the way by the lower entrance to the Forum shops and all the way to the front. So that's the street named after Jay Sarno. But Jay, once again, in many ways, he absolutely transformed Las Vegas before Howard Hughes even got here. So that was before then. He was a visionary. Despite, he had obviously his faults, but you have to give credit where credit is due. So that's the story.